One last repetition for those who are just jumping on. My name is Steve Serra. I'm a senior advisor for WASH with the Pro WASH Award. Thank you all for joining. We appreciate you signing on to the call. If you haven't had a chance, please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, organization, and where you're located, and we'd appreciate it. So to start off with the webinar today, as many of you know, Pro WASH is a USAID Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance funded award that aims to provide implementing partners with capacity strengthening support, along with knowledge sharing and applied research support for WASH activities. The webinar today is the first in a three-part series that we're holding on the links between WASH and nutrition, and specifically some of the work that Pro WASH has done with partners on generating more evidence on environmental risks for children and applying that new evidence to programs. Before we begin, I just want to make sure that everyone knows that French interpretation is available for the webinar. If you'd like to join the event in French, please click on the small globe at the bottom of your Zoom screen where it says interpretation, and then click your preferred language. Once you've selected your language, you can also choose to mute the original audio, or you can hear it in the background at a lower volume if you'd like. This webinar is also available in French by clicking the link just shared in the chat box. And if you have any technical issues during the session, please just privately chat Pro WASH, and we'll do our best to assist you. This will also be recorded, so you can access the recordings later. And please note that if you have any questions for the presenters today, we'd like you to post your questions in the chat, which you can do at the bottom of your screen, and we'll reserve some time at the end for questions and answer and discussion at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'll introduce our presenters today. First up is Tino Mavuti. He's a WASH technical advisor with ADRA International. And ADRA is the implementing partner of Resilience Food Security Activity in southeastern Madagascar. It's called FIOVANA, is the name of the project. And they've been working with us on this research, along with our colleagues from Acquia, who are Chloe Pauline and John Trimmer. Chloe and John led the research that we're going to present today. And first, we're going to have Tino just give a brief description of FIOVANA as a project and its objectives and how this research relates to that. And then afterwards, Chloe will dive into details on the research in terms of methodology, results, and implications. So without further delay, I'll pass it over to Tino. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. The FIOVANA project is a USAID-funded resilience food security activity led by the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, ADRA. FIOVANA seeks to improve the health and nutrition of approximately 428,000 individuals through a combination of multi-sectoral interventions focused on improving agriculture, livelihoods, nutrition, and WASH. The FIOVANA project is working in the southeastern regions of Vatovavy, Fitovinany, and Tsimatsinanana, which collectively have the highest rates of poverty, in food insecurity, and stunting in the country. Program activities focused on WASH are specifically targeting improvements in access to and quality of household level water supplies, hygiene behaviors, and sanitary household and community environments. Findings from previous rounds of similar projects in southeastern Madagascar indicate context-specific challenges to increasing coverage and acceptance of improved sanitation. And so in order to complement and strengthen FIOVANA's ongoing WASH activities, the program sought to also implement targeted interventions focused on improving hygienic household environments for children under the age of 2. Fiovana's theory of change and interventions are designed to address barriers and needs through a socio-ecological model that transforms behaviors and norms at the individual, household, community, and institutional level. ADRA, with support from partner FHI 360 and through engagement with local stakeholders, strives to use context-specific, evidence-based SBC methods to address social and behavioral causes of poor health and nutrition. So to reinforce that context-specific knowledge, Fiovana recognized that it would be important to investigate what happens when excreta inevitably ends up in the environment. What are the public health risks posed, particularly to children under the age of 2? What does the Fiovana project need to know in order to effectively intervene and inform its programming? A better understanding of pathogen transmission pathways and the most impactful soft and hard interventions that can be employed to interrupt these pathways will enable the project and national stakeholders to better adapt interventions. After several months and contributions from several experts, it's truly exciting to finally witness the conclusion of the study. And so at this point, I'll pass it over to the amazing team at Acquia. Thank you.
Thank you, Tino. Thank you, Steve, for the introduction. So now I'm going to present the results of the pathogen pathway study for children under the age of 2 in the Fiovana intervention areas of southeastern Madagascar. So we worked on this study during the last year, and yeah, I'm going to present the results. So first of all, why is it important to study exposure pathway to fecal pathogen? So being exposed to human and animal feces can cause enteric infection. In other words, we're talking about intestinal or bowel infection that can lead to diarrhea, which is the 3rd cause of mortality among children under 5 at World scale. In Madagascar, 50% of children under 5 tested positive for pathogenic intestinal microorganism, which increased the risk for their immediate and long-term health. Because enteric infection can contribute to malnutrition via poor nutrient absorption, poor appetite, and anemia. So for example, among children under 5, 50% are stunted in Madagascar, and the mortality rate is really high. We have 62 deaths out of 1,000 births at national scale versus 37 at world scale. Next slide, please. So before introducing the research question, I'm going to present the pathway that can result in exposure to fecal pathogen. So we usually display this exposure pathway through a Neff diagram, which is displayed on this slide. So the source of the pathogen can be either from animal or human feces, and then the pathogen can be directly or indirectly ingested via 6 different pathways. So we have, first one is food. This is a direct ingestion. Then we can find fluids like water, like drinking water, and via poor water quality, for example. We have fields that represent soil that can be directly or indirectly ingested by children or people. We have flies that can contaminate the food. Contaminated fingers via hand-to-mouth contact can contaminate the victim. And then we have the fomites that are the object for contaminated object that people will put in their mouth and got sick through this object. Next slide, please. So through this project, we try to answer 2 main research questions. The first one is to identify the main ingestion pathway of fecal pathogen for children under the age of 2 in 3 regions of southeastern Madagascar. And the second one is to identify specific intervention that could interrupt this pathway. And this intervention should consider the local cultural context and also the local challenges. So for example, the remoteness of the villages, for example. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with the methods, and then I will present the results, and finally the recommendation that we've made to interrupt this pathway. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes the method. So we started a phase of fieldwork that we divided into two phases. We had a phase 1 of in-depth observation that included 1 hour household survey with WASH and socioeconomic related questions, 2 to 4 hours of structure observation to characterize children behavior, and a phase of E. coli sampling of different environmental compartments. The second phase of fieldwork included a shorter household survey. From 1 hour, we shortened the survey to 15 minutes. We replaced the structure observation with spot observation of the house surroundings that included, for example, the materials that is used to build the house, whether there's water around the house, whether we can observe pieces around the house, etc. We continue sampling for E. coli for each household. And then for a subset of 20 households, we sample for other pathogen analysis. So 2 major cyclones that hit our 3 study region in January forced us to pause phase 1. And then we restarted fieldwork after a few months later. So we study 15 households pre-cyclone for phase 1. Then we study 20 households still for phase 1, but after the cyclone. And then for phase 2, we study 185 households. So following the phase of fieldwork, we conducted a statistical analysis by using QMRA, which means quantitative microbial risk assessments, to assess the risk of infection and illness associated with different exposure pathways. We then provided some recommendation to interrupt this pathway. Next slide, please. So our study took place in 3 regions of Southeast Madagascar, and we visited a total of 21 villages that we also call Fukutan in local language in Malagasy. And we installed our fieldwork for E. coli analysis in Manakar. So this is the purple star that you can see on the left, on the right graph, which was a pretty central location to move around. We selected the different villages in collaboration with ADRA to provide a good representation of the different ethnicity, agroecological zones, so coastal villages versus highland villages, and also the different level of WASH practices. Another aspect is that the villages had also be no further than a 3 hours drive from the lab, which is Manakar, to be able to process the E. coli sample within 6 hours after collection. Next slide, please. So in addition to household survey and E. coli sampling, we also collected some data through structure observation to understand children's behavior and to develop appropriate recommendations. So to characterize the children's behavior, we reported the environment, which is the general site of the child's activity, and that includes whether the child is inside the house, outside the house, but close to the house, in the kitchen, in the livestock area, or in the fields. We also reported the compartment, which is the child's specific location within the environment. So the child could be on improved ground, such like a mat, for example, or on an improved ground, which can be bare soil. Off ground, that can be carried in the back or in the arm of the parents, for example. And then we also put 2 other options, whether the child was close to open water or a drain, or whether the child was close to trash or rubbish area. And then finally, we also reported the activity of the child. And we timed each activity in a specific compartment and specific environment. And we also recorded the frequency of hand-to-mouth contact. Next slide, please. So after the phase of fieldwork, we conducted a QMRA to identify the main exposure pathway and the risk of infection and illness associated to this pathway. So a QMRA quantitative microbial risk assessment comprises of 4 steps. The first one is the hazard identification. And so for this, we selected a pathogen, which is E. coli, and we decided to work with one of the strain of E. coli. Then after identifying the pathogen we're going to work with, we have to assess the exposure assessments. So we selected 4 exposure pathway to work with. Next slide, please. And we selected drinking water, soil, cooked and raw food, and hand-to-mouth contact. And for this, we collected children and caregiver hand ribs. And so we sampled E. coli for each of these different compartments, and then we analyzed E. coli via the compartment backtest method. So we didn't work with fomites, as this pathway is usually less important than hand-to-mouth contact according to literature. And we didn't work neither with flies, as capturing flies requires additional resources that were difficult to obtain in remote areas. Next slide, please. So after the exposure assessment, the third step seeks to establish a dose response model to estimate the amount of pathogen ingested per day and per child. So for that, we use the Beta-Poisson model regression. And finally, the last step is the risk characterization. So we computed the probability of being sick for 3 outcomes: watery diarrhea, bloody diarrhea, and death from diarrhea. And then we turned this probability of being sick into DALY, that means disability adjusted life years, that measure the years of healthy life lost due to a specific disease. But today I'm going to present the first 3 steps of the QMRA and then the recommendation, but I'm happy to answer any question for the last step of the QMRA. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through the result now. So I'm going to start the result with some general statistic about the household and the children that we observed. And then I will describe the children's behavior. And then I will present the result of the E. coli contamination and the exposure assessments. So we survey a total number of 220 households, 15 pre-cyclone for phase 1, 20 post-cyclone for phase 1 still, and 185 for phase 2. And among the children that we observed, 57% were girls. We divided the children into 3 age categories, 0 to 6 months, 7 to 12 months, and 13 to 24 months. And as you can see, we had twice as more children in the 3rd category. And this category corresponds to a specific stage of the development stage of the children. So in terms of nutrition, the percentage of children breastfeeding decreases with age. In the 0 to 6 months category, 90% of children were still breastfeeding, while in the 2 other categories, between 82 and 86% of children were still breastfeeding, but were also having solid food. And 18% of the 13 to 24 month category is eating solid food only. Next slide, please. So the result of the structure observation showed that children usually stay inside or outside, but close to the house. So for the 0 to 6 months category, children spend 80% of their time inside the house, and this percentage drops to 40–50% for the 2 other categories. Only children between 13 to 24 months were observed in the kitchen, which represents 11% of their time. And we observed only 1 children being in the livestock area, and we didn't observe any children in the field, which might be due to an observation bias, because we arrived in the field around 9 to 10 a.m. and people working in the field already left because they usually leave pretty early in the morning. Next slide, please. So when children are growing, they spend less time off ground, meaning in bed or being carried by a caregiver, for example. And the time spent off ground goes to 66% for the 0 to 6 months category, down to 23% for the 13 to 24 month category. On the opposite, the time spent on improved or non-improved ground increased with age as children became more mobile. So for example, children between 0 to 6 months spend 5% of their time on non-improved ground. And this number increased up to 29% for the 7 to 12 months category and up to 35% for the 13 to 24 months category. And we observe very few children close to open water, meaning that according to our results, children were not in contact with open water. Next slide, please. And so finally, in terms of activity, children spend most of their time eating, playing, and sleeping. So when children are growing, they spend less time sleeping. This percentage goes from 40% for the 0 to 6 months category, down to 13% for the 13 to 24 month category. And they spend more time playing, 39% from babies under 6 months up to 60% for the last category. We observed only 3 children among 35 washing their hands. And here we might also have another bias of observation. So our observation typically took place between 10 to 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. that include lunchtime, explaining why children spend a quarter of their time eating and drinking, which is quite a lot. Yeah, next slide, please. So in addition to children's behavior, we also gather data about wash access. And we observe a really poor access to wash services. So for example, the result we had showed that 30% of households have access to an improved water source, and another 30% of households fetch water directly from the river. 58% of households are still practicing open defecation. So this number is for caregiver only. For children, around 50% of children under the age of 2 were practicing open defecation, where when the other half was using reusable diapers. Only 10% of households have access to a hand washing station. And about 70% of caregivers reported at least 1 episode of diarrhea per year among children in the 7 to 24 month category. Next slide, please. So this poor access to wash services explain the high E. coli contamination of the different environmental compartments. So this slide shows the E. coli result for the different environmental compartments. There are children hand drains, caregiver hand drains, drinking water, soil, cooked food, and raw food. And E. coli is expressed as the most probable number. And then we broke down this result according to WHO risk level. So 0 MPN is low risk, is safe. 1 to 10 MPN is intermediate risk. 11 to 99 MPM is high risk, and above 100, most probable number, we consider very high risk. And so you can see that soil and drinking water are both highly the most contaminated compartment, with between 60 and 80% of the sample for drinking water and soil being in the very high risk category. It's followed by children hand drains and caregiver hand drains, with around 25% of sample being in the very high risk category. And the number of sample for food is pretty low for cooked food and for raw food, because there was kind of the food shortage after the 2 cyclones. So it was difficult for the households to give us a little bit of food. And raw food is even lower because children usually do not eat raw products such as salad or tomatoes, so we couldn't sample a lot of raw food. Next slide, please. So we combined these results of E. coli with the amount of soil and cooked food and drinking water ingested per day and per kid, and the frequency of hand-to-mouth contact. And combining these two informations allow us to quantify the amount of E. coli ingested per day and per children. So you can see that the amount of E. coli ingested per day increased with children's age. It goes from 20 mpn per day for the 0 to 6 month category, up to 232 mpn per day for the 7 to 12 month category, and up to 260 mpn per day for the 13 to 24 month category. So these results are consistent with children development. As children grows, it interacts more with its environment, eats more food, and drink more water that is possibly contaminated. So for the 0 to 6 months category, the main pathway was through soil that represent 43% of E. coli total ingestion per day. For the 7 to 12 months category, all pathways were important except food, that represented only 11% of the E. coli ingestion per day. And for the 13 to 24 month category, all exposure pathways were important. Next slide, please. But the uncertainties on the quantity of E. coli ingested per day are pretty high when we consider findings from other studies. So on this slide, the box plots represent the range of uncertainties based on literature value, and the black dot represent our estimate value based on our field data. So yeah, we have a pretty high range of uncertainties. Next slide, please. So in addition to E. coli analysis, we also sampled for pathogens. So we sent around 100 samples to Institut Pasteur Madagascar to analyze 7 different pathogens via qPCR. And we sampled for drinking water, soil, children's handprints, and children and animal species. And the samples are actually still being processed and analyzed at Institut Pasteur, and I hope we'll be able to share the result pretty soon with you. Next slide, please. So after identifying the main exposure pathway per age category, we worked with ADRA and Intensica, which were also our local partner, to provide some specific recommendations to interrupt this pathway. So I'm going to start with a general recommendation, and then we will see the specific recommendation that we can provide per pathway. Next slide, please. So through the FIOVANA project, ADRA has different field agents in these 3 regions, and these field agents are here to support communities and to conduct awareness campaign on hygiene. And so our first recommendation, of course, would be to strengthen their work by following 3 main steps. The first one will be to identify bottlenecks in behavior change, because people might be aware of good hygiene practices, but do not implement them in their day-to-day life. So, for example, more than 80% of caregivers reported to us to wash their children's hands more than 3 times a day, but we only observe 3 children among 35 washing their hands. The second step will be to promote communities on solution as well as model households to encourage other households to adopt safer hygiene practices. And it can be done through regular community consultation meetings led by a local leader or a field agent or a health agent, for example. And during this meeting, people can share their ideas on how to improve hygiene at their home. The first step will be to support and develop household action planning. So for example, again, field worker or health agents can visit households and help them develop tailored, detailed action plan tailored on household specific needs. So for example, they can help a household to use more often latrine, to use improved source, for example, if there's some improved water source available, to build hand washing station, or to develop specific hygiene practices. So for example, using reusable diapers for children if they are still practicing open defecation. And finally, we would also recommend focusing on the 7 to 24 month age categories, as they ingested a significantly higher number of E. coli per day compared to the 0 to 6 months category. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to provide specific recommendation per specific pathway, and we're going to start with drinking water that represented around 20% of E. coli ingested per day. So for drinking water, people should be encouraged to use improved water source. 30% of households still fetch water from the river. We would like also to encourage like the treatment water at the point of collection, because water treatment is one of the most effective interventions for limiting pathogen ingestion through drinking water. And so we would recommend to do treatment at point of collection. And for example, using inline chlorination system or a chlorine dispenser to make sure that water is properly treated. Then the third step will be to develop, strengthen awareness of water contamination at the point of use, because we think that there's a lot of contamination of water between the point of collection and the point of use. And so it can be done to help households to identify 1 or 2 types of containers that should only be used for drinking water, and try also to increase access to containers with a lid and a small opening, such as jerry can, to encourage pouring water instead of scooping with a utensil that can be contaminated. And then the first point for drinking water will be to strengthen the general awareness about water contamination. So for example, in the 3-study region, there's a local belief that water never gets dirty. So we would recommend to develop awareness campaign to stop this belief and to reinforce also knowledge about water flow. Because, for example, washing diapers, it's like pretty common practice. Washing diapers in the river, is a pretty common, it's a widely used practice, and people should understand that they contaminate people downstream when they are doing that, and they also might be contaminating themselves by other people upstream who also wash diapers in the river. So it would be important to develop this general awareness. Next slide, please. Then the soil ingestion pathway represents 30% of E. coli ingested per day. So some studies have shown that low-cost household level wash intervention might not be enough to reduce fecal exposure in settings where all environmental compartments are highly contaminated with feces, which is the case in this study. And so animal husbandry interventions, such as confining and fencing animals to areas where children would be discouraged to play, might significantly reduce the environment's feces contamination, especially in the 3-study region where the animals are freely roaming around the houses, and because we also observe animals within the house. So we know that developing animal fencing will be challenging in this specific local context, but it might be possible with a multi-sectoral project like Fiovana, with a lot of awareness campaign and some action to support the more vulnerable households to get access to material to be able to fence their livestock. So then, of course, reducing open defecation is also a must. A study in a few countries in sub-Saharan Africa showed that the best approach to significantly reduce open defecation is to combine intensive health promotion campaign, such like community-led total sanitation, for example, with subsidies to support vulnerable households and to also support households to build safe and sustainable latrines. And then the first point to interrupt the soil pathway would be to reduce exposition to contaminated soil by improving the type of floor, for example. So in Madagascar, people usually use mats that are made of natural fiber, and they usually place their babies on the top of these mats, which is good because babies are not directly in contact with soil. But these mats get dirty pretty quickly, and they're not easy to wash as they're made of natural fiber and pretty heavy and big to carry. And so in this specific context, we would recommend the use of ballotum, which is small pieces of fabric in Malagasy that could be placed on top of the mat and will be way easier to wash. Next slide, please. Then we have hand-to-mouth contact that represent 20 to 30% of E. coli ingested per day. So for this, we would recommend, of course, to strengthen awareness and to increase knowledge of risk associated with child mouthing behaviors. So for example, it can go through a group discussion where people can talk about appropriate solution that can interrupt this pathway. We can also think of using visualization tools such as glitter to represent contamination on hands. And so people can visualize when they have, for example, feces on their hands and they touch other things, the contamination spreads. Then developing hand washing station, it's also recommended, and we can support and promote the construction of low-cost hand washing station with local materials. And also because soap is usually really expensive for rural households. So it would be nice if projects like Fiovana could continue developing local businesses to produce soap, to decrease the price of the soap in the market and to allow a wider access to soap. Next slide, please. And then finally, the last pathway is cooked food that represents 11 to 30% of E. coli ingested per day. So this will be, to stop this pathway, we should encourage good hygiene practices and to develop food hygiene intervention like Fiovana is doing, and focus on hand washing before food preparation to encourage safe food storage, to avoid contamination through flies and through dust, and also to encourage disinfection of utensils that can be contaminated. We would also recommend to develop awareness about contamination introduced through domestic animals, because we saw animals in the kitchen and also in the house. And we also saw livestock feces in the house. So yeah, developing this awareness to make sure that animals stay outside could be efficient. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And yeah, finally, the conclusion. So we saw that the daily intake of pathogen increased with age, which is pretty consistent with children's development. As the children grow, they interact more with their environment, eat more food, and drink more water, increasing the chance of ingesting fecal matter. We also saw that the main exposure pathway also varied with age. For children under 6 months old, the main pathway was soil. For children between 7 and 12 months, it was soil followed by hand-to-mouth contact and drinking water. And for the third category, the 13 to 24 month, all pathway played an important role in E. coli ingestion. So we also saw that access to safe wash services was very low in this study region. So we would recommend to develop and to strengthen this wash infrastructure, and to also develop, keep working on awareness campaign to induce sustainable behavior change. And future work should also focus on limiting contamination by livestock to reduce the general load of contaminants present in the environment. So thanks everyone for your attention. And I think now it's the Q&A session. I think you can write your question in the chat box and Steve will moderate this Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chloe, for presenting on the research and the results. We appreciate it. Thanks also to the Acquia team and NT for conducting the research, and Fiovana for facilitating that research and agreeing to take up the results. We have a list of about 10 questions here that I'll get to in just a moment, but I also just wanted to provide a little bit more context in terms of how we're thinking about these results and what we're planning collectively between ProWash, Acquia, Fiovana, and NT to do with them. The third webinar in this three-part series is going to bring together our research and project teams from Madagascar and also from the sister research and project in Kenya that will be presented on November 17th. So the third webinar will bring those teams together to discuss how we will take these somewhat general and a little bit predictable results that we found under this research, and how they will be contextualized through the programs to integrate, specific solutions into the work plans of these ongoing programs. So just keep that in mind, and hopefully you'll be interested to tune into that discussion in the third webinar, which will take place on December 6th. So now, Chloe, a few questions that I think you're probably best placed to answer, so I'll pose them to you, but feel free to pass off to other team members as needed. The first one is, were there any specific reasons why you designed this research as a phased approach, and were there things from phase 1 that informed phase 2?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. It's a good question. Yeah, so the phase 1 was really the in-depth observation. We wanted to get a sense of children's behavior, but also where we could find the contamination in the environment through E. coli sample. And then depending on the results of the E. coli sample, we wanted to narrow down the sampling for phase 2, but we realized that everything was contaminated in phase 1. So we decided to almost keep the same approach for sampling for phase 2. And it's just the structure observation that was pretty long that we couldn't transfer to phase 2. So we just used some interesting information that we got from structure observation that we transcripted into the spot observation for phase 2.
Thanks, Chloe. And then there was just a quick question just to confirm that it was that you guys observed 100% breastfeeding and no bottle feeding, or was there bottle feeding seen?
So the question we asked to the caregiver was breastfeeding only and no bottle feeding. And so it was 100% of breastfeeding, I would say.
Thanks. Could you elaborate a little bit on why you guys chose the selected time frame for the observations between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m.?
Yeah, sure. So the villages were pretty far away from Manakar, where the Animorium was based. And so it took us between 1.5 hours and 2.5 hours to reach the villages usually. And when we reached the villages, we had to see the mayor, the king of the village, the chief of the village to obtain all this authorization. And then to find households start with the 1 hour household survey. And so everything added up that we were not able to start the structure observation before 10 to 11. And then we stopped everything at 3 p.m. because we had to count like 1 to 2 hours to go back to Manakar to bring the sample and to leave enough time to the lab analysis team to process the sample on time.
Great, thanks, Chloe. Were the soil samples from areas surrounding the home, or were they also from dirt floors inside the home?
No, it was just soil outside the home, and like we were asking the caregiver where the children were playing, and we were sampling soil from this playing area, but in the really close to the house.
Great. There's a few questions around, I guess, water contamination and treatment. The first question was around insights on how you think water is being contaminated. I know you mentioned washing diapers in the river. Are there any other insights you have on what's contaminating water sources?
So for example, as you say, Steve, like people were washing diapers directly in the river. That might be a source of contamination, as well as sending livestock to the river where livestock can defecate directly in the river. But there's also a lot of opendification that can also contaminate the water source. And I just want to highlight here that we sample drinking water at point of use, so inside the household, and we didn't collect water and analyze water at point of collection. And we also think there's a lot of contamination from the point of collection and the point of use through, for example, dirty hands or dirty buckets where water will be poured in and will be contaminated because of like this degraded quality and contaminated utensil like bucket or even like small cup that are used to scoop water out of the bucket. So all of this can contaminate the water or recontaminate the water.
And you had mentioned in your recommendations water treatment solutions or interventions at point of collection. Do you think that considering point of use treatment solutions would also be feasible, or was there a reason why you didn't highlight that?
Water treatment at point of use show also good results, but some studies have also shown that like it's difficult to have sustainable water treatment at long term at point of inside the household, and it's usually linked to like the degree of education of the household, etc. And so that's why I privileged the option of treating the water at point of collection in this study, because I think it's like a more sustainable way to do it if possible, of course.
Okay, good. I'm going to stop going in order of the questions we received, because I think some of these questions are questions that we're still asking ourselves, and we're going into a series of meetings over the next few weeks to try to grapple with some of the questions around what the specific approach would be to implementing some of these solutions. But I'll just try to hit a few more of the questions. One was, what was the data for the basis of choosing E. coli as the most relevant pathogen for the risk assessment?
Yeah, so it's simply because we had a lot of E. coli results. So we got around 800 to 900 E. coli results. And so for the statistical analysis, we need a lot of data. And so E. coli in this case was the most appropriate because it's also easier to analyze compared to pathogens that are still being analyzed right now. And we also collected like less sample for pathogen, would put like way higher uncertainty because we don't have enough number of sample for pathogen. So that's why we choose E. coli.
And of course, there's still some other pathogen sampling that's being completed in the lab now. And so we should be able to report out on those results in a few weeks' time. How were you able to estimate the proportion of E. coli ingested from each pathway, especially soil and hand to mouth?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we, through structured observation and through household survey, we had a few questions that help us to estimate the amount of soil ingested per day, or the amount of drinking water drunk per day, and the hand to mouth contact. So for example, for hand to mouth frequency, during structured observation, enumerators were counting each time children were putting their finger into their mouth. For soil, we had a question in the household survey asking to the caregiver if they saw their children eating soil, and whether it was the quantity between 2 fingers, a handful, things like this. Same for drinking water. We asked whether how many cups the caregiver were giving to the kids, and we have different size of cup. And for food, we use value from literature.
Okay, thanks. Chloe, I might step back and give you a little bit of a break and maybe turn to a few questions that maybe Tino or John or other team members from NT and Fiovana could help answer. One of them is, there's a lot of solutions recommended were around behavior change. If we had to choose 2 or 3 behaviors to focus in on, are there any insights so far on which ones we might focus in on through the rest of Fiovana's implementation period?
I could take that one, Steve, but well, I hesitate to give an answer because, like you mentioned, this is still part of an ongoing conversation. I think this week and getting into next week, part of what the team is doing is organizing a workshop with national stakeholders to pass through all of these potential pathways that we could target, and identifying where would have the most impact if we were to target them. And then I think from there, we would get into a conversation about the specific behaviors to target and how best to modify our SBC strategy so that these behaviors are sufficiently addressed. So I guess in a few weeks, we'll have an answer to that. I hesitate to select which 2 to 3 behaviors would be the most impactful before that conversation happens.
Yeah, thanks, Tino. I might also just chime in a little bit to say that it's interesting to see that that based on the age range of the children, there are a different number of pathways that seem to be important. So one of the things we've had initial discussions on with the team is potentially staggering interventions to focus on 1 or 2 behaviors that might be most important in the first 6 months of life, and then add on behaviors over time that are more important for the older ages. So that's something I think we'll explore in those discussions. Another one for potentially Tino or the Fiovana team, based on the results, are there any things you guys would change about the design and implementation of the program so far? And I might expand on that question and just say, like, was there anything that was shocking or that wasn't considered in the program design at all that you guys are now considering including in these follow-on discussions?
Already included in the program design, yes, but I would say perhaps focusing more on it is environmental cleanliness and just hygiene around the household. That's something that's already in the design, in the program design, but admittedly, there hasn't been as much focus on those activities. So, village cleaning, waste management around the household, So those would be some of the areas that I would imagine we're going to be focusing more on based on results that are coming in, most of which have been pretty obvious, that, you know, the vicinity around the house and immediately outside the house are where children spend most of their time. So focusing on making sure that that environment is clean is a good place to start in terms of the things we want to focus on going forward.
Thanks, Tino. I appreciate it. I think we're going to have to leave it there, even though there's a few outstanding questions. We can try to respond to the rest of them over email. I just wanted to remind everyone that there will be recordings available, I believe in English and French afterwards. So we'll be sure to distribute that once they're available. And also wanted to just re-emphasize that this is the first webinar in a 3-part series. So there was a similar study that we did in Kenya with Innovation for Poverty Action, UC Berkeley and NC State, and the Mercy Corps-led Nawiri Resilience and Food Security activity there. So those results will be presented on November 17th, and then our panel discussion with the research teams and the project teams from these activities will be on December 6th. So please sign up and tune in to those as well. And we're also generating a quick guide through ProWash on how other partners might replicate or advance research and learning on this topic. And so we're hoping to publish that quick guide towards the end of November or in early December. So be on the lookout for that as well. Thank you so much for tuning in for this presentation. And this concludes our webinar. Have a good rest of the day or evening.